Hello, everyone, and thank you for coming. I'm pleased to introduce Professor Shintaro Miyazaki for our session today. And because this group is dedicated to automation and labor, I thought it might be a good occasion to use the AI system ChatGPT for writing my introduction. If you haven't heard about ChatGPT, it's a huge hype at the moment. So I typed in all the information about Shintaro I like to share with you, and the artificially produced introduction sounds as followed. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Automation Cultures Group. I'm excited to introduce our presenter for tonight, Shintaro Miyazaki. Since 2020, Shintaro has been a junior professor for digital media and computation at the Department of Musicology and Media Studies at the Humboldt University, Berlin. Before that, he was a senior researcher at the Institute of Experimental Design and Media Cultures of the Academy of Art and Design, University of Applied Science and Arts, Northwestern Switzerland. From 2017 to 2020, he was the program curator of the IXDM's Critical Media Lab. One of his notable projects is the Sensorium of Animals, which explores the potential of electroreception in media and design research. His latest publication, Digitalität tanzen, or in English, Dancing the Digital, discusses the transformative power of media technology and how society has to deal with it. He envisions a life in which profit and property no longer play a role, but the sustainable interplay of the needs of our living ecosystems with those of all people has top priority. Tonight, at least here in Australia, tonight Shintaro will be presenting some fresh ideas on operativity, not only as a technical term, but as a political one inspired by Tony Negri and Nick Dyer with Ford. His presentation will focus on linking labor, life, and automation in this context. I'm sure this will be a fascinating and thought-provoking presentation, so please give Shintaro a warm welcome. So now it's me, David, again. Shintaro, the virtual stage is yours.
Thank you. I was very much looking forward, and I'm still looking forward to the discussion and your feedback after I gave this 30 minutes talk, I guess. And yeah, thanks for the invitation, and looking forward to your thoughts. And I was looking at the website, which was already, and the list of people who already talked, and was quite impressed. Yeah, I tried to link these ideas you are working on, labor, life, and automation. So let me begin with sort of a tuning exercise to build a sort of common basis with your project. So first topics I thought which might be interesting is, as far as I understood, the manifold relationship between art, automation, labor, creativity, and productivity. And the second field of interests oscillates around topics such as the agency of machines, of animals, and human workers, I guess. And another third topic I would find maybe is the role of imagination while studying automated labor. So I will try to speak to these topics, and I relate labor, and especially wage labor, as a space and time-limited activity of a machine, an operator, a worker, or an agent requiring energy and work, which is sold to a company or some other institutional entity as a service, usually lending to some form of product or material manifestation. And wage labor generates productivity through operativity, I would say, and is a result of the division and rationalization of labor as such. And underlying such processes are operations of commodification, of valorization, which are implying questions of materialization, also representation, and of course, as a media studies person, of storing, I would say, of capturing, and capturing aspects of the labor activity. And the captured processes are given a value, a number, a price, which then are related to other prices and values, creating a media system usually called market, right? And so there seems to be an interesting link between correlation and commodification. a service or a product only gets an exchange value and becomes a commodity when part of a network of correlated things or processes coordinated into a unified value system, usually attached to some currency or other monetary forms. So the famous example by Marx is 20 yards of linen have equivalent in one code, and the price code, right? And the price of 20 yards of linen is, let's say, $100. So furthermore, in order to automate labor, you need to divide it into smaller steps and isolate the workers, etc., etc. And a vulgar Marxist critique usually diagnoses that all these processes, and thus also those of automation, happening within such a framework are drawn into an eternal, never-ending positive feedback loop of profit-making and growth. So very roughly speaking, value extraction and capture have been always already automated, you could say, since the beginning of the division of labor in manufactures and factories. And what happened after 1750, you could call something like the outsourcing of automation from humans to animals and plants, and to machinery, of course, and advanced technologies, such as computers and telecommunication networks and their infrastructure. And we know that there were and are always backward processes of rehumanization, you could say. So Amazon's Mechanical Turk, for example, or artificial intelligence, those are only two of the most famous developments where work and labor machines are supposed to do what is done usually as humans. And seemingly simple operations are not yet automated, or maintaining a machining system is too expensive. And then human labor is in the global south is much cheaper than just setting up expensive machinery or program them. So to put it simple and short, automated labor in capitalism is not a solution, and it will never be. So we need to change the whole system from bottom up, right? And of course, there are many interesting ideas to tackle this problem, such as self-organized bottom-up socialism based on solidarity, cooperativity, and focus on covering basic needs and wants of all members of a community instead of profit-making, enriching the privileged. And technology could, of course, help and facilitate here. And most of these ideas are also attempts to self-design cooperative infrastructures, and some activists and scholars even imagining a sort of community-driven automation. So here the concept of the commons and of commoning is, in my opinion, the most pertinent of those many concepts. So commons are resources and structures, but also processes, not owned by one private entity, nor by a state or another top-down authority, but owned and maintained, shared, organized, used, produced by all who want to and who take part. And then commoning is the activity linked to these commons, right? And so commoning is also always some sort of cooperativity of humans and other entities, machines, algorithms, animals, plants, etc., coming together. So, for example, a piece of a forest can form a commons as a piece of land, but also the trees, plants, and animals living in that forest. And some of the trees then are managed by the wood commons, for example, which forms a sub-commons within the forests as a common. And there might be also be a kind of a wood house builder commons, who shares work, knowledge, and expertise on wood house building and so on. There might be also be a wireless network commons, providing free internet for all forest residents, and so on. So each commons is then kind of self-governant, and you can kind of entangle them, encapsulate them. Architecture you can build with these commons. So usually commons are only thought about as one thing, but some propose that you need to sync them in kind of networks and as entangled entities. So here questions such as is there a commonist way of automation and a commonist solidarity-oriented market-free needs and wants-oriented form of computation, of planning and modeling? And other question would be, or is automation as such a capitalist process? And again, here there are many theories, approaches, and perspectives. And the only thing is that most of them are not fully implemented or in action. And a lot of commoning projects stay on the small scale of 50 to 100 persons, basically on community level. And as soon as we are on a kind of so-called society level, going beyond this famous Dunbar number, this kind of psychologist, I think, who said we can only memorize about 120 persons. So that's kind of the maximum size of a community which is only working on face-to-face communications. And as soon as we go beyond, we need some forms of mediated forms of commoning and organization. And then here the question of media technology and of automation and algorithms and so on come into play, right? So to be repetitive, there are also interesting examples like cooperative farming, free software, cooperative housing, and so on, but they are not so connected yet. So one of the basic requirements for a new approach would be that it needs to be bottom-up, self-organized, and similar to actually how the unwanted free market works, but without competition, without pricing, without commodification and overproduction and those things leading to waste, right? And here, finally, this is my entry point for my own approach or proposal, which is like, trying to tackle these questions from the side of dance and from modeling and all these kind of keywords you can read here, which are listed up here. And then we try to now go into detail. Now, here I would like to focus a bit on some new things for me. So these are the role of affect, the role of autonomy and affect, but also the neurology of body movements and dance and learning. So, and then there are some links I found out between history of the democratization of software and programming, which are from the early on were linked to embodied thinking or cognitive pedagogy and stuff like that. So the reason for my interest in dance is that it enables me to see computational processes, rhythms and signals in relation to moving bodies. And dance is an epistemic filter, you could say, to look at processes which are at work, or to look at work and at labor as some form of dance. Also, you can look at processes of machines and rules and so on within dance, and there are a lot of these interrelationships or these links you could then make between algorithms and dance and choreography and so on. And also dance is theorized as being linked with larger movements and having to do with solidarity and social movements, for instance. For example, there is this early rave culture in Chicago or in England or in Berlin, where dancing and social movement was very tightly coupled. So dance forms coordinated mass behavior, but is also different from a drill, I would say. So in order to think and theorize about new forms of cooperativity and solidarity-oriented communist automation, it is, in my opinion, important to draw a difference between dance and drill. And drill is closer to static forms of automation. It is ruled by hierarchy, you could say, simply. It's ruled by strict rules and ultimately by a sort of closed order. Whereas dance is more adaptive. emphasizes the freedom of each of its agents. And of course, some dance forms can also be strictly rule-based and might be organized by top-down centralized structures, but it is always possible to introduce self-determination, whereas in drill there is no freedom allowed, right? And it's about full control and subjectivization. So in dance, it's allowed to break the rules and so on. And dance is and drill is more about, maybe you could say it's purely acrobatic, and it's about the precision of its movement. But in dance, there's something introduced, there's meaning introduced, or symbolism, or narration, and so on. And of course, dance, therefore, is closer to a sort of bottom-up, self-organized, open, adaptive, and ever-changing form of movement organization. Still, it is it incorporates aspects of learning, which are also important for drill. So it's somehow related to drill, but no, this kind of mostly in aspects of when it's about learning. So learning and mostly learning of quasi-automated body movements. And these learning processes are constituted not only by imitation, but also by semiotic, language-oriented guiding and descriptions. That means these are not merely non-discursive or purely motor-based forms of movement learning, but the role of language in kind of this movement acquisition process is equally important. So while in drill, you would merely learn, talk about, and train a sequence of body movements, in dance, you would additionally reflect and talk about their meaning, or at least their quality. And more generally, articulated learning processes offers research topics for a vast range of scientific fields, but in the humanities have been mainly touched upon by affect theory and neighboring theories inspired by the cognitive sciences. So affects are processes occupying the in-between of the somatic non-conscious on one side and the recognized, thus perceived, on the other side. And I refer here to the German media scholar Marie-Louise Angerer. She writes, quote, affects dwell at the transition. They guard the interval, guarding against closure. And this is an English translation. There's an English version of her German book. And there's also a more direct translation, which would be affects are the custodians of the never closing. So anyway, affects are somehow acting in between these kind of perceived and conscious, processes and the unconscious or non-conscious physiological processes. And famously, Brian Mazzumi defines affect as being autonomous, and affects are based on, as I said already, somatic phenomena and neurophysiological signals traversing our bodies, and we cannot capture these with language and semantics, but only like physiologists can measure them with media. And this kind of brings him to the idea that, or brought him to the idea that affects are autonomous. And so they are not fully controllable. And thus there are something which phenomena which come close to signaling and music and vibes and rhythms and so on. So, and Mazzumi's concept of the autonomy of affect resonates also in my theory with the notion of the autonomy of labor by Italian Marxist Antonio Negri, or like respectively the Interpretation, I know from the Canadian Marxist media scholar Nick Dyer-Widderford. And Dyer-Widderford describes this Italian autonomous movement as a movement emphasizing the importance of the worker and the operator again, so operativity here, right? And that once they stop working and they reorganize and work for themselves, capital cannot control these workers anymore. So there is some sort of autonomy of labor and work, and this notion of work or labor is much closer to life, and therefore also cannot be, fully controlled. So these are kind of the similarities, and I think there is a lot to build upon that, but I think, yeah, I leave it here. And it's also a little bit underdeveloped in my theory. I just like this kind of linkage point. And so to come back to dance, dance is then the place and activity where both these notions of autonomy come together. So the first related to affect and the second related to work. To have a concrete example, I would like to mention here the so-called sensory motor synchronization, which you might know, which is usually studied via finger tapping and finger tapping experimental setups. And so this is a vast research topic, and it's just interesting, for example, that it's proven that there is usually some sort of, if you tap your finger to a metronome, there's usually some sort of anticipation error, which can be up to 50 milliseconds, so not so much, but professional musicians, they can prevent that anticipation error, or they can learn and train to overcome this kind of anticipation that you tap faster than the metronome. It's only 50 milliseconds, but it leads also to the tendency that you tap faster and faster if it's not kind of controlled. So for me, this is kind of an example where you have this kind of signaling, perception, but also learning behavior and so on. And it's about motoric, something motoric. So it's also related to the perception of rhythms and so on, and then dance. And this example also introduces the complicated relationship between prediction, control, anticipation, and so on. And in the general theory now, as far as I understood, it is common that perception is understood as an active, not passive process, an active generative process, which is always comparing the new perceived signal with already learned signals. So perceiving and also moving is oscillating between the confirmation of first beliefs and kind of their disconfirmation. So you could interpret this scientific explanation of motoric processes thus also as sort of body movements, of course, and as a form of predictive modeling and of modeling the future, which is sort of kind of implemented in our circuitry. And so this is kind of the kernel of my idea, namely the attempt to sync the neurophysiological and cognitive processes involved in dancing, implying some sort of modeling of future together with computer modeling and more specifically agent-based modeling. So in order to do that, I need to introduce a bit of historical contextualization of one school of computer science, maybe a minor one, but for me it's interesting, evolved around a figure called Seymour Papert, and he was at MIT, and his programming language Logo. It's something from the 1960s, and it's kind of an early version of what we know as today as processing. So Parpet was influenced by the constructivist pedagogy famously developed by Piaget. And also he wrote this book, Mindstorms, Children, Computers, and Powerful Ideas, which is like a monograph of how we could better learn programming, which came out in the early 1980s. And the monograph expresses many interesting ideas for this kind of early computer pedagogy. And the most interesting for me, at least, was the one about the Samba school. So I quote, you can read here, logo environments, so these programming environments are like Samba schools in some ways. In them, mathematics is a real activity that can be shared by novices and experts. The activity is so varied, so discovery rich, that even in the first day of programming, the student may do something that is new to the teacher. So for Parpet, this activity is also sort of an embodied one, if you can read that throughout the book, and involving the sensory motor system. So in my terms, it's about programming as sort of dancing, you could say. And Parpet's logo project inspired many other further projects. A lot of them also then linked a decade later in the 1990s to the emergence of so-called agent-based modeling. So while logo basically could only simulate 1 point on a canvas, with this other new software or programming language called Star Logo or Net Logo, you could simulate hundreds or even thousands of points, often called turtles, or then also agents. So you can see here on this picture with these small children, one of these turtles, which has kind of a pen, and then you can draw some, you know, you can program it, and then it's an agent, and it draws things. And agent-based modeling basically is then just the multiplication of these kind of turtles. And also we can remember that the 1990s is or were the age of complexity science, and also of new programming paradigms, such as the emergence of object-oriented programming. So this object-oriented programming then kind of enabled this kind of agent-based thinking, and that you can program little objects which then kind of behave as you programmed, and then they have input and output and so on. What is kind of normal for us now is kind of this paradigm, is within this paradigm of object-oriented programming. So compared to the older system dynamical models, agent-based models were not top-down models based on differential equations, for example, but like bottom-up models, right? And agent-based models also led to these kind of smart swarm models or bird flocking simulations. And in this context, context of the 1990s, two disciples of Parpet, namely Michel Resnick and Uri Wilensky, become important for this kind of story. So they both developed this individually the programming environments, which enabled, like as I mentioned already, this agent-based modeling and this programming and the learning of it. So they tried to make create logo versions. So they called it Star Logo or Net Logo of where you can do agent-based modeling, but for engineering students or even younger kids to learn about complexity science, which was new then, and to learn about how little changes in the constellation of swarms, for example, can lead to unexpected behavior and so on. And when at conferences, besides talking about their new programming language, Resnick and Wilensky also did modeling exercises with their participants. And this is one of another kernel idea of connecting dance with computer modeling, namely the one that you can also dance computer models. So especially when they are simulating the behavior of individual agents. So one exercise Resnick and Wilensky describe in a paper is about decentralized communication. And in this exercise, the group, let's say, of 30 persons is divided maybe randomly into 6 different groups by distributing kind of small paper notes with a number written on it. And then once each of these 30 persons got this small paper note, the first aim of the first round is to find other persons with the same group number. And then you can observe what happens, and usually people start to shout and shout their group numbers, and then it gets organized quite quickly. And then you can reduce the communication possibilities. So, for example, the second round could then be there could be the rule that you are not allowed to shout or nor show the note to the others. And then so they need to walk around and whisper maybe or speak to each other individually, but there is no sort of centralized broadcast of information. And then you could, in the next round, you could introduce kind of blindfolds, for example, and then people need to, the communication possibility is much more reduced and so on. And these sort of exercises, then you can also, of course, simulate in a very simple agent-based model. But it's also insightful for the participants to experience that, and then it leads according to Resnick and Wilensky, leads to reflections upon self-organization and emergence of complex behavior and so on. There is another interesting model I would like to show at this point, and then I think I have 2 or 3 more slides, but then I'm through with my thoughts. Let me share. Can you see this now? Yeah. Okay. Yes. So this is another model, another agent-based model. Maybe you came across it. It's based on the model segregation model by Thomas Schelling. Thomas Schelling got a Nobel Prize in economics, I guess, for I think other research. But this segregation model is also cited a lot, and then it was implemented later on in a software. Schelling himself, he did it with coins and little toy things, but it's kind of a model which is used to legitimate race segregation, and that it's not possible to prevent race segregation because there is kind of a tipping point, and it's very difficult to prevent. So this is how the story starts, and it has a good ending. So just follow me. So so this is a story of how harmless choices can make a harmful world, and then you can, this is interactive, and you can draw this triangle over here, and then it's happy because it's kind of alone, but here it has some friends which are similar to it, right? So this is also about this phenomena of homophily, and maybe Wendy Chung's work on homophily and how she criticized it. But and she also mentions kind of these segregation models. So basically, yeah, so segregation happens very fast, and you can, so the tipping point starts with this very small number that less than 33% of my neighbors are like me. When this is not, so if this is the case, then I move. So it's a very low number. So those people are still, you could say, very tolerant, but still it generates these kind of, segregated regions. So, and the point is, so, and this was used for this kind of argumentation I already mentioned. And the interesting thing is that you can, with a little change and introducing something like a diversity factor, you can prevent this kind of segregation. So I move if less than 10% or more than 80% of my neighbors are like me. So if there are too many of people like me, then I also move, right? And this leads to a much different pattern, which is not, not so, if you compare it to here, it's not so segregated. There are not so many clusters of same colors. Like here, there are still some, but it's more or less, if you look at here or here, it's better distributed. So this is for me, this is some kind of phenomena which is based on, you could say, also some sort of autonomy of the model, because the model has built in some kind of knowledge which was not intended at first place, but if you play it a little bit with it, then you can have other versions or other knowledge. You can create other knowledge with it. So yeah, maybe the comparison to the other autonomies are a little bit difficult here, but this is what I at least try to do. And then also I think about, algorithmic systems which are getting out of control, for example, which are, by little mistakes introduce new complete other behavior which was not intended by the programs. So like network breakdowns and so on, due to little mistakes in the code. So this is for me like an example of the autonomy of simulation. So yeah, so another way to think about, of coupling modeling, programming, and dancing is, of course, also live coding. And probably, you could also do live coding with agent-based models. And I refer here to our friend from New Zealand, media dance and music studies scholar Sally Jane Norman. She defines live coding, I quote, as a way of tuning our cognitive and sensory faculties to enfolded layers of micro, meso, and macro temporalities, keeping up with our irreverently outwitting machinic and hybrid forms of liveness, gambling with their parameters, valuing agnostic creative engagement with powerful symbolic systems over their docile or numbly passive use. So I like this quote because it's kind of, it sheds light on live coding in a little bit different way, and connects, these kind of cognitive and sensory aspects with coding and computers. So I think this is also useful. Dancing the digital or dancing digitality also implies some sort of, this is the last point, some sort of community or utopia rehearsing, you could say. by enacting and playing an agent-based model, or an agent in an agent-based model. So here I imagine something like you could say federated or decentralized multi-user online or mixed reality game, where we could dance together glimpses of these communist societies yet to come. And I frame here gaming such a model as a sort of also a sort of ritual and practice of futuring. Yeah, so far I think my thoughts, and yeah, this is the German version now out. And yeah, as I said, yeah, thank you very much for your attention, and yeah, looking forward to the discussions now.